The sun hung low over the vast dusty plains, painting the horizon in streaks of fire and amber. Dust swirled around the old homestead as the rancher, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from years of hardship, gripped the reins of his weary horse. His eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the crumbling structure he had once called home. It had been years since anyone dared set foot in that place, a house that had survived storms, fires, and neglect, only to bear the weight of bitter memories. Today, he had decided, it was time to tear it down. The rancher swung down from his saddle, boots sinking into the dry earth, and stared at the weathered timbers. Each beam seemed to whisper secrets of the past, secrets he was determined to bury. He lit the first match, setting fire to the wooden planks, and the flames hungrily devoured the house, sending black smoke curling toward the darkening sky. There was a strange satisfaction in the act, a sense of cleansing, as if he could finally leave behind the shadows that had haunted him for years. Just as he turned to ride away, a sharp sound cut through the crackling of the fire voice, low and steady, calling from inside the ruins. He froze, heart hammering, as the smoke parted to reveal a figure emerging from the flickering flames. The man was tall and imposing, wrapped in the quiet authority of someone who belonged to the land, yet moved with the precision of a predator. His eyes, dark and calculating, locked onto the rancher with an intensity that made the air itself seem to shiver. The rancher's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he hesitated. Something about this stranger was different. He was not a man looking to befriend or beg. He carried a presence that demanded respect, a history written in scars and unspoken stories. It did not take long for the rancher to recognize the legend, the most feared Apache of the territory. A man whose name had caused settlers and outlaws alike to rethink their paths. A tense silence settled over the smoldering ruins. The rancher's mind raced. How had this warrior come to live in his old house? Why had he chosen this forgotten, broken place as a sanctuary? Memories of long nights spent alone, of threats from neighboring bands and lawless men, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the danger now standing before him. The fire crackled, the light casting monstrous shadows, and the rancher realized that what he had intended as destruction might have stirred forces he was not prepared to face. The Apache stepped closer, the sound of his boots on the scorched earth steady and unyielding. His hand rested casually on the hilt of a knife, but his gaze told of a cunning mind always a step ahead. He spoke, his voice smooth and deliberate, carrying both warning and challenge. "This place is mine now," he said simply. There was no malice in the words, only certainty. It was the kind of certainty that could unnerve the bravest of men. The rancher swallowed hard, flames reflecting in his eyes. He had built his life on the land, on the sweat of his brow and the strength of his arms. He had faced droughts, cattle rustlers, and rival ranchers. But this was something else entirely. The legend of the Apache was real, and he was here, standing where no one should have dared to live. Every instinct in the rancher screamed for him to turn back, to leave the house and the man in peace, but pride anchored him in place. He could not simply retreat. Not yet. For a long moment they measured each other in silence. Two men bound by the land, yet divided by fate. The rancher thought of the town nearby, of neighbors who whispered rumors of ghosts and spirits, of dangers that lurked in the desert after sundown. They had all feared this house, avoided it like a wound in the earth. And now the most feared Apache had claimed it. Living among its ruins as though it were his rightful throne. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and smoke, and the rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had come to destroy a building, to erase a past he no longer wished to carry. Instead, he had stumbled into a living legend, a force as wild and untamable as the plains themselves. He realized that the old house was no longer just wood and nails. It was a stage for a story far greater than his own, a story that had only just begun. The Apache's eyes followed his every movement, reading intentions before they were even acted upon. There was a quiet power in that gaze, a reminder that the land had its own rules, and any man who challenged them could quickly become history. The rancher's hands trembled slightly, not from fear of injury, But from the realization that his world had shifted in a way he could not yet comprehend, then, as if to test him, the Apache spoke again, his voice calm but cutting through the evening stillness like a blade. Some things you cannot burn, some things you cannot destroy. And some men, he said, pausing to let the weight of the words settle, are already here before you know it. The rancher's mind raced, a storm of confusion, curiosity, and caution. He had torn down houses before, faced down enemies, and survived more than most men could endure. Yet here in the dying light of his old homestead, he felt the sting of uncertainty sharper than any gunfire or storm. The Apache's presence was a riddle he could not solve, shadow he could not outrun. As the flames dwindled, the night began to stretch over the plains, deep and unbroken. The rancher knew he had to make a choice: retreat and risk leaving secrets untold, or confront a force that had already claimed his past and might very well dictate his future. He drew a slow breath, the weight of years pressing down on him, and met the Apache's gaze once more. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, the unspoken threats and uncharted possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, Coyote cried, echoing over the hills like a warning. The rancher tightened his jaw and gripped his rifle, knowing that what happened next could change everything. The house he had once called home was gone, but its story, its mystery, had only just begun. And in the center of it all stood the most feared Apache, a man whose presence promised that no one would leave this place unchanged. The wind picked up, scattering embers across the scorched earth, and the rancher realized that this night, this encounter, would mark the beginning of a tale the plains would whisper for generations. Yet he did not know if he was prepared for what lay ahead. One thing was certain: the old house was no longer his, and the legend living within it was not a story that could be ignored. The rancher stood rigid as the shadows of night began to swallow the edges of the plains. His mind wandered to memories he had long tried to bear nights when the wind howled like a pack of wolves across the mesa. Days when drought had turned his cattle to shadows, and the bitter fights over land that had left scars deeper than any knife could cut. He had thought he understood hardship, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the presence of the Apache, who now claimed his old home. The Apache stepped closer to the dying embers, his movements precise and silent, a predator accustomed to the rhythm of the land. The rancher noticed the way the man's eyes scanned every corner of the ruin, as though reading a story written in splintered wood and ash. There was a purpose behind his gaze, a history that demanded respect. The rancher realized that this man was not just a survivor of the plains. He was a force shaped by them. The rancher's name was Braxton Cole, a man whose reputation stretched across the territory for hard work and unwavering resolve. Yet even Braxton felt a flicker of unease in the presence of the Apache. The stories he had heard as a boy came rushing back, tales of men who had vanished after crossing paths with this legendary figure, men who had underestimated the cunning and speed of a warrior born to the land. Braxton had always dismissed such stories as exaggeration, folklore, to scare children. But now he faced the reality that legends could walk in flesh and bone. The Apache's name was Tequil, a name whispered with caution in towns miles away. His past was a tapestry of survival, strategy, and battles waged both with weapons and wit. There were rumors of him moving silently through the deserts, striking only when necessary, and disappearing into the night before anyone could strike back. But what had brought him to the ruins of Braxton's old home remained a mystery. Tequil did not speak of the past lightly, and the way he regarded the rancher suggested he carried secrets that could shift the balance of power across the plains. Braxton's mind churned with questions he did not dare voice aloud. How had Tequil survived the harshest parts of the land? Why had he chosen this particular house to inhabit? And most unsettling of all, what did he intend now that the rancher had returned? Each question felt like a spark in the dry air, threatening to ignite a confrontation neither man fully understood. The wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying the scent of charred wood, sagebrush, and distant rain. Braxton's horse shifted nervously nearby, as if even the animal sensed the tension gripping the space. He tightened his jaw, refusing to show weakness, though the truth was that he had never felt more uncertain in his life. He had come with the intent to destroy, to reclaim control over a place tied to his past. Yet the presence of Tequil had changed everything. Tequil's gaze held a quiet intensity, and for a moment, the rancher caught a flicker of something almost human beneath the surface, a memory of loss. A hint of loneliness, perhaps even a burden carried over countless years. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the calm, lethal focus of a man who had learned to trust only his instincts and the land that had raised him. Braxton sensed that this was a man who had faced death more times than he could count, and each encounter had hardened him rather than broken him. As the firelight waned, Tequil began to move through the ruins with a deliberate pace, examining the remains of the house with hands that had known both creation and destruction. He paused at the fireplace, a place where Braxton had once gathered family and friends. There was a story here, Tequil seemed to say without words, a story he intended to read. Braxton felt the weight of the gaze, as though the Apache could see not only the house, but the man who had built it. The struggles etched into his very bones. Braxton's thoughts turned to the town nearby, to the people who relied on him for protection, work, and guidance. They did not know the full story of the plains, the dangers that moved unseen, the alliances formed and broken in shadows. He had always believed he could control the land, tame it, shape it according to his will. Yet here, in the ruins of a house meant to hold only memories, he realized that some forces were beyond control, forces that demanded not just strength but wisdom, patience, and respect. Tequil finally spoke again, his voice carrying easily over the rustle of dry leaves. "This place remembers more than you do," he said, each word deliberate, "and so does the land." The rancher swallowed hard, trying to measure the meaning behind the statement. It was as if the house, the plains, and the warrior himself were all part of a living puzzle, one that Braxton was only beginning to glimpse in the flickering shadows. Braxton noticed the Apache's movements were not random. He traced patterns along the scorched floor, touched the remaining beams with care, and seemed to pause at places where Braxton himself had once felt the weight of loss and grief. The rancher understood that Tequil was not just a visitor or an intruder. He was a man who recognized history, who could read the land as if it were a living chronicle, and who had perhaps chosen this ruin for reasons that went far deeper than survival. Night deepened across the plains, and the stars began to prick the dark sky with cold light. Braxton could feel the land around him shift, subtle but undeniable. The whispers of the wind sounded almost like voices, carrying the weight of generations that had lived and died here, now seemed to watch the encounter unfold. There was a tension in the air, a sense that time itself had slowed to bear witness to a meeting of two formidable wills. Tequil finally turned to face Braxton fully, its expression unreadable. "You have come seeking to destroy," he said, the words calm, almost neutral. "But destruction can reveal truths you are not prepared to see." Braxton felt the words settle like a stone in his chest. He knew the Apache spoke not just of the house, but of something far greater, secrets, legacies, and power hidden in the land. Waiting for the right moment to emerge, the rancher's pulse quickened. He realized that Tequil's presence was not random, that the house had been more than a home, and that the ruins held more than charred timber and ashes. Somewhere beneath the surface, stories waited to be uncovered. Stories that could shift the balance of the plains, stories that Braxton might not survive if he misstepped. Every instinct he had honed over decades urged caution. Yet his pride and curiosity anchored him firmly in place. A sudden movement in the shadows drew his attention. Something, or someone, moved beyond the tree line, silent and deliberate. Braxton squinted, trying to pierce the darkness, but the night offered no answers. The plains had always been full of hidden threats, but this felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the land itself held its breath. Waiting for the next move in a game that neither man fully understood, Taka's eyes flicked toward the movement. And for the first time, Braxton saw a glimmer of calculation, a hint of strategy in his measured stare. He realized then that the Apache was not merely defending a home, he was guarding something far more significant. Something tied to the land, the past, and perhaps even the future of the territory itself. The rancher felt a chill run through him. The house he had thought he controlled was no longer just his past. It was a nexus of mysteries he could barely comprehend. The night stretched on, each passing moment thick with tension. Braxton and Tequil remained locked in a silent understanding. Neither willing to make the first move, both aware that the plains themselves had rules that could not be bent. The fire had almost died, leaving only embers glowing, like watchful eyes. Every sound, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of leaves, the sigh of the wind, seemed amplified, signaling that the night held more than darkness. It held choices, consequences, and the promise of revelations that might never come to light if misjudged. Braxton finally took a measured step forward, his boots stirring the scorched soil. He had survived storms, bandits, and fire, yet the presence of Tequil made him feel small in a way he had never known. The Apache's calm confidence radiated like a shield, yet it also hinted at untold depths, secrets that might consume anyone foolish enough to probe too closely. The rancher realized that whatever happened tonight would define not only the story of the house, but also the destiny of the land around it. Takio's voice broke. The heavy silence once more, deliberate and unwavering. Some men think the past can be erased with fire, he said, his eyes fixed on Braxton. But fire only exposes what lies beneath. The rancher's jaw tightened as he absorbed the words. He understood, finally, that the ruins of the house were not merely the end of something. They were the beginning of a story that could change everything he thought he knew about the plains, about the land, and about the man standing before him. The wind shifted again, and Braxton felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. Somewhere out there, the land was alive with possibility, danger, and the promise of revelation. The night held its breath, and the rancher knew that the events to come would demand courage, cunning, and a willingness to face truths he had long avoided. He took another step, each movement measured, knowing that the smallest mistake could tip the balance between survival and destruction. Tequil watched him carefully, a shadow of a smile on his face, as though he understood the storm brewing in the rancher's mind. The ruins of the old house glowed faintly in the ember light, a silent witness to a confrontation that had already begun. The plains stretched beyond them, dark and unyielding, as if daring the two men to uncover the secrets buried beneath dust, timber, and history. And in that moment, the rancher realized that he had entered a story far larger than himself, a tale that would test his strength, his wisdom, and his courage. The Apache's presence was a puzzle he had yet to solve, a force as untamed and unpredictable as the land itself. The night whispered of challenges yet to come, of mysteries waiting to be unearthed, and of a connection between the past and the future that neither man could ignore. Braxton's eyes met Tequil's once more, the unspoken understanding between them, thick with tension. The old house had been destroyed, but its story was far from over. And somewhere deep in the darkness of the plains, forces both seen and unseen waited for the next move, ready to shape the destiny of those who dared to step into the ruins. The night was far from finished, and the secrets of the old house and of the feared Apache who now lived there were only beginning to reveal themselves. The plains lay quiet under a moon that hung pale and heavy in the sky, but the silence was deceiving. Even as Braxton Cole stared at Tequil, the weight of the land pressing against him, he felt the stirrings of other forces moving beyond sight. The townsfolk had always whispered about the old house, speaking of shadows that lingered long after the sun set. Some said spirits of past owners roamed the ruins. Others claimed wild men had taken shelter there, but none had ever been as real or as dangerous as the figure standing before him now. Braxton shifted his stance, boots crunching against the scorched earth. He'd always trusted his instincts, but tonight, instincts alone were not enough. The Apache's calm, measured presence unnerved him more than any storm or gunfight ever had. He could sense that Tequil was not merely defending a home, he was guarding secrets older and darker than the charred beams around them. The rancher had faced rival men, lawless bandits, and even wild beasts, but the tension in the air told him this night was a different kind of danger, one that tested not just strength, but understanding. From the edge of the ruins, a figure emerged, slender, quick, and deliberate. Her name was Leora Blackwell, a scout from a neighboring ranching family. known for her knowledge of the plains and her uncanny ability to read the signs of the land. She had been tracking unusual activity for days, whispers of a man living in the ruins no one dared approach. Her sharp eyes took in the scene: Braxton, the flames, and the shadow of Taka, and she crouched behind a rock, considering her approach. She knew that revealing herself too soon could ignite a conflict neither man wanted to start, but she also carried news that might alter everything. Leora had watched Tequil from a distance before, learning the patterns of his movements. He was methodical, patient, and rarely acted without purpose. Yet something about the interaction tonight hinted at a larger game being played, one that involved more than land, cattle, or personal pride. She felt a shiver run down her spine, realizing that the legend she had studied might now intersect with lives and choices far beyond her control. Meanwhile, Braxton kept his gaze locked on Tequil, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He had faced storms, blizzards, and bitter winters that threatened his ranching empire. But none of those challenges carried the weight of uncertainty pressing against him now. The Apache's words lingered in his mind. Fire exposes what lies beneath. The house had burned, but what remained was something more, something alive, hidden, and dangerous. Tequil moved with a purpose that seemed effortless, yet every action carried meaning. He touched a charred beam, knelt to inspect the soil beneath a collapsed wall, and paused at spots where Braxton's memory of the house clashed with what remained. It was clear to Braxton that the Apache saw patterns and connections invisible to anyone else. There was a history embedded in the ruins, and Tequil had come not to claim the house alone, but to protect something far more consequential. Leora finally stepped closer, her presence now visible. Braxton flinched slightly, but quickly regained control. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady despite the tension. The scout stepped into the moonlight, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Name's Leora," she said calmly. "I've been tracking someone who shouldn't be here." Her gaze flicked to Tequil, assessing him as one would a dangerous predator. "It's like you found him first." Tequil's eyes shifted briefly, acknowledging her without words. There was a silent exchange, an understanding that Leora's intrusion was neither threat nor coincidence. She carried knowledge of the surrounding lands, rumors of raiders moving at night, and hints of hidden caches of supplies that could fuel conflicts far beyond the ruins. Her arrival introduced a new layer of complexity to the already tense standoff. Braxton felt the weight of multiple angles pressing down on him. There was the Apache, whose presence challenged everything he believed about control and authority. There was the burned house, holding secrets of the past and echoes of unfinished stories. And now there was Leora, a living thread connecting him to broader risks he had only glimpsed. The rancher understood that tonight would not be resolved with force alone. Insight, strategy, and courage would be demanded in equal measure. Tequil finally spoke, his voice low, almost contemplative. "The plains remember who comes and who stays," he said. "Yeah. They also remember those who try to take what is not theirs." Braxton tightened his grip on his rifle, the words cutting deep. The Apache was not threatening him in the conventional sense. Instead, he was reminding him that the land itself had rules beyond any man's command, rules that could shape destinies in ways invisible to those who ignored them. The night air carried distant sounds, the low howl of wolves, the rustle of small animals moving through dry grass, and the faint clatter of something unseen. Leora tensed, her senses alert to every movement, while Braxton felt an uneasy connection between the sounds and the tension in the ruins. It was as if the land was alive, aware of the three of them, and waiting for a single misstep to ignite chaos. Tequil knelt again, tracing patterns in the dirt with a finger. And Braxton noticed a series of subtle markings, symbols etched in ashen soil that hinted at a map, or perhaps a warning. The Apache's past was etched into the land, just as Braxton's memories were etched into the charred wood of his old home. Each marking seemed deliberate, a thread in a larger story neither man could yet fully comprehend. Leora took a cautious step forward, voice calm but firm. "There's more at stake here than just land or a burned house," she said. "Reports from neighboring ranches indicate movements in the territory, bands of men, some armed, others desperate. They might have heard of Takel's presence and think it an opportunity." Her words layered a new dimension of risk onto the already fragile tension. Threats were not merely local anymore. They could escalate quickly if outsiders realized what lay hidden in the ruins. Braxton felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. His own pride and need for control were now entangled with forces he barely understood. He realized that the Apache was more than a legend. He was a guardian of something powerful, something that could ignite conflict across the territory if mishandled. And Leora, with her sharp intelligence and awareness of the broader dangers, had become an unexpected ally, or perhaps another complication. The night deepened, and shadows stretched long across the scorched earth. Tequil rose, moving slowly to the edge of the ruins, as if listening to the land itself. Braxton noticed the subtle signals, a twitch of an ear, a shift of weight, the faintest glimmer of steel under a coat. Keel was aware of more than the two people in front of him. He was aware of the planes, the unseen watchers, and perhaps even threats that had not yet arrived. His vigilance reminded Braxton that every moment of hesitation could tip the balance of power. The rancher took a measured breath, glancing at Leora. Her presence was steady, but he sensed her own mind racing, calculating possibilities. He realized that the trio of them, Braxton, Takil, and Leora, were now bound together by circumstance, each with a stake in the unfolding story, yet none fully aware of the consequences of their choices. Suddenly, a distant horn broke the stillness, carried faintly on the night wind. Leora stiffened. "That's a warning," she said. "Someone is out there testing the territory. They know Tequil is here." Braxton's pulse quickened. The plains had shifted from a silent witness to an active participant in the unfolding drama. Forces were moving in the darkness, unseen yet undeniable, and the old house, though burned, had become a focal point for power, history, and danger. Takil's eyes flicked to the sound, expression unreadable. He moved with precision toward the tree line, every movement deliberate. Braxton and Leora followed cautiously, understanding that any misstep could ignite conflict with unknown adversaries. The night had become a chessboard, each of them pieces in a game controlled by history, land, and legend. Braxton realized that the Apache was not merely a man to confront or outwit. He was a living embodiment of the land itself, a reminder that the plains did not forgive ignorance or arrogance. And yet, there was an unspoken invitation into Koa's stance and opportunity to understand, to adapt, and perhaps to uncover truths buried beneath layers of history, fire, and fear. The wind shifted again, carrying scents that Braxton could not fully identify, but that spoke to the mystery still hidden in the ruins and the surrounding plains. He knew that decisions made tonight would ripple far beyond the burned house, affecting lives, fortunes, and perhaps the balance of power across the territory. As the three figures paused at the edge of the ruins, shadows stretching long and uncertain under the moonlight, Braxton understood that the night was far from over. Conflicts had been seeded, subplots were unfolding, and the mysteries surrounding the Apache, the old house, and the surrounding lands were only beginning to surface. Somewhere in the darkness, eyes watched, waiting, calculating. The plains held their breath. The fire had revealed only fragments of truth, and the old house whispered of stories yet untold. Braxton, Leora, and Takil were bound together now, each a player in a drama that had no clear beginning and no predictable end. The tension pulsed in the night, a living thing, reminding them all that survival, knowledge, and power would demand courage, patience, and an understanding of forces far beyond their control. The night stretched on, thick with expectation. The past had been unearthed, secrets stirred, and the first moves of a larger story had begun. And in the shadows beyond the ruins, forces unseen waited, ready to test the resolve of those who dared walk into the mysteries of the burned house and the legendary Apache who now called it home. The wind had grown colder, slicing across the plains like a steel blade, and the faint glow of the embers from the old house barely lit the ruined timbers. Braxton Cole's eyes never left the shadowy outline of Tequil, whose every movement was measured, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. The night had become a living thing, full of whispers, unseen motions, and the faint rustle of creatures that knew better than to approach. Every instinct in Braxton's body screamed that this night would test him in ways he could not yet measure. Leora Blackwell crouched beside him, her gaze scanning the surrounding trees, rocks, and hills. She was a scout by nature, and every sense in her body was alert. "They're close," she murmured, barely moving her lips. Braxton nodded subtly, feeling the truth of her words in the tightening of his chest. It was not just the land or the night that carried danger. There was a presence moving in the darkness, unseen but deliberate. Someone or something had taken notice of Tequil, and by extension him. Tequil moved toward the tree line, the pale moonlight glinting off a knife strapped to his hip. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce the night itself. Braxton realized then that the Apache was not only guarding the ruins but protecting something beyond comprehension. He could feel the weight of history pressing down, the land itself demanding vigilance. Tequil was a man born of the plains, molded by storms, battles, and loss. And he had a reason for standing here that Braxton could not yet fathom. Braxton shifted, gripping his rifle tightly. He had faced men before, men with guns, knives, and ruthless intent. But this was different. Tequil was not merely a man to be confronted. He was a force, and the land obeyed him as naturally as it obeyed the wind. Leora's voice cut softly through the tension. "Braxton, they're circling closer. Not all of them will wait for daylight." Her words were calm, but they carried urgency. The presence beyond the trees was intelligent, deliberate, and patient. Braxton's mind raced. He could picture the possibilities. Rival ranchers drawn by rumors of the ruins, desperate bandits seeking resources, or perhaps men who had once crossed Tequil and now sought vengeance. Every option carried risk, yet hesitation could be fatal. He glanced at Tequil, who stood motionless, listening, reading the land in ways Braxton could only guess. There was a rhythm to his stance, a code woven into every gesture, and the rancher realized that survival depended on learning, observing, and matching the Apache's precision. The night deepened further, shadows thickening like ink over the plains. A distant cry of an animal broke the silence, and Braxton flinched as if it were a signal. Leora moved to his side, silent, watching. "They're testing us," she whispered. "They want to see how alert we are, what we will do, and where we are weakest." Braxton nodded, feeling the weight of the words. The ruined house had drawn attention, but its secrets were far from simple. Every beam, every scorched plank, and every shadow carried meaning beyond the immediate danger. Tequil's eyes flicked toward the sound, expression unreadable, and he moved again, swift and silent. Braxton followed cautiously, aware that even a single misstep could alert whoever or whatever was circling. He realized the Apache's presence was not just protection, it was a lesson. Tequil had survived the harshest parts of the plains by reading signs invisible to others, by trusting instincts honed over years of danger. And now Braxton had to learn the same lessons or risk being left behind or worse. From the distance, the wind carried faint voices, low and harsh, carrying the scent of fire and sweat. The attackers or scouts were closing in, yet they had not revealed themselves fully. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was amplified in the tense air. Braxton felt his pulse hammering, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, observing the patterns, the rhythm of the land. The subtle signals Tequil sent without speaking. Leora's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a silent reminder that he was not alone. "We need to move carefully," she said. "Every decision counts. One mistake, and everything changes." Braxton nodded, absorbing her calm determination. She was no mere observer. She was an ally, a strategist, and perhaps the only one who could help him navigate the unpredictable terrain of both the land and Tequil's presence. Tequil stopped at the edge of the ruins, crouching slightly, his eyes scanning the horizon. He reached toward the ground, fingers brushing against something half buried in the dirt. Braxton strained to see, but the darkness kept the object hidden. There was a moment of hesitation, a suspended heartbeat, and then Tequil lifted his head slowly, eyes fixed on the tree line. The rustle of leaves grew louder, closer. The first figure emerged, shadowed and deliberate, and then another and another, until the darkness seemed alive with motion. Braxton's hand tightened on the rifle. His instincts screamed for immediate action, yet Tequil remained calm, a pillar of unshakable focus. There was a rhythm to the Apache's movements, a silent code that Braxton did not yet fully understand, and he realized that acting too quickly could destroy everything. The unknown figures stopped at the edge of the clearing, their intentions hidden, but their presence undeniable. Leora whispered, "They're testing strength and patience. Don't make the first move unless you're certain." Braxton nodded again, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. This was no longer a simple encounter over land or pride. It was a test of wit, courage, and the ability to survive forces moving as surely and silently as the wind. Takiel's voice broke the tense silence, low and calm. "The plains choose who survives and who does not," he said. "They remember, and they strike when the moment is right." His eyes locked with Braxton's, and for the first time, the rancher understood. Takiel was preparing him, not merely for defense, but for the demands of a land that required strategy, intuition, and respect. Every movement of the approaching figures would be met with precise counteraction, every sound analyzed for meaning, and every shadow weighed against the possibilities of attack. The first figure stepped into a patch of moonlight, a scout sent to gauge the strength of the defenders. Braxton's breath caught as he saw the glint of metal and the hardness in the man's eyes. More figures emerged, circling slowly, deliberately, like predators testing the boundaries of their prey. The tension was nearly unbearable. A taut wire stretched across the plains, ready to snap with the slightest misstep. Leora leaned closer, whispering again, "They're calculating. They're waiting for fear. Don't give them that advantage." Braxton nodded, feeling his heart hammering, yet his mind sharpened. Fear was a tool, yes, but it was also a trap. He had to control it, channel it, and act only when the time was right. Takiel's calm presence offered a model, a reminder that patience could be stronger than gunfire. The night seemed to compress, shadows thickening, every sound amplified. The approaching figures were close enough now that Braxton could hear muffled words, the clink of equipment, and the faint shuffle of boots over dry earth. Takiel's movements became a study in precision, a silent dance with danger, while Leora's eyes tracked every detail, noting patterns and potential weaknesses. Braxton felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, the realization that everything he had believed about survival and control was being tested at once. Suddenly, a single branch snapped loudly, and the figures froze. Braxton felt the tension spike, muscles coiled like springs. The first attack or first challenge was imminent. Tackle's voice cut through the charged silence, calm yet authoritative. "Move only when necessary. Let the land guide you." Braxton understood this was no ordinary defense. This was a trial of skill, patience, and courage, where every heartbeat mattered. The figures began to shift, circling wider, testing the perimeter, and the tension became nearly unbearable. Braxton's fingers itched on the rifle, yet he held, trusting Takiel's rhythm, Leora's insight, and his own hard-earned instincts. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the moment when force, cunning, and courage would collide. From the shadows, a faint light appeared, a signal from one of the approaching men. Perhaps a warning, perhaps a challenge. The air grew thick with anticipation, every sound, every movement magnified. Braxton felt the weight of what was at stake, the ruins, the land, Takiel, and Leora, all entwined in a web of tension that promised revelation or disaster. Takiel shifted slightly, eyes narrowing, and Braxton realized that the Apache was preparing for something decisive. Leora whispered again, "This is it. The moment they test everything we've shown them." The wind carried the faint metallic scent of danger, the air trembling with expectancy, every second stretched. A drawn-out heartbeat of tension waiting for the inevitable clash or revelation that would define the outcome. Braxton's pulse raced, yet he felt a strange clarity. The trials, the threats, the unknown force, his end in his mind, his awareness, his ability to read the land and anticipate the movements of both friend and foe. The night had become a crucible, and he understood that whatever happened in the next moments could change everything, lives, legacies, and the destiny of the land itself. And then, the figures in the shadows paused, sensing the readiness of those standing in the ruins. The night trembled with unspoken anticipation. The plains themselves seemed to whisper as if reminding everyone present that some stories were larger than any single man, that legends could walk, and that the next moment could decide fates for generations. Braxton tightened his grip on the rifle, Leora's presence a steady anchor, Takiel's calm, precise focus, a model of unyielding strength. The tension stretched to the breaking point, shadows and silence holding the world in suspended motion. Whatever came next would test courage, cunning, and loyalty, and the plains would judge without mercy. The first real step toward confrontation hung on the edge of the night, the ruins of the old house glowing faintly in the ember light. The approaching figures, the whispers of the wind, and the watchful eyes of the plains all seemed poised for impact. Braxton, Tequil, and Leora understood that the night's trials were far from over. Yet the first choices had been made, and the dance with destiny was ready to begin. The tension was absolute, the stakes unimaginable, and the land itself waiting for the moment when courage, cunning, and wisdom would collide in a test of survival. Trust and power. The night air hung heavy and still over the plains as Braxton Cole, Tequil, and Leora Blackwell stood at the edge of the ruins, every sense alert. The figures that had circled the old house for hours had finally revealed themselves bandits. Opportunists drawn by rumors of the Apache's presence and by the whispers of power hidden in the ruins. They stepped into the clearing, weapons glinting in the moonlight, but their confidence wavered the instant they took in Tequil. The legend they had feared had been real all along, and standing before them was a man whose skill, strategy, and calm authority left no room for hesitation or doubt. Braxton's hand remained on his rifle, yet his mind was sharper than ever. He had learned from Tequil over the night the rhythms of patience, the precision of observation, and the power of timing. As the first bandit lunged forward, he acted with confidence, moving in coordination with the Apache. Tequil's movements were swift, calculated, disarming threats with skill that seemed almost effortless. Leora stayed close to Braxton, reading the attacker's every shift and whisper, signaling their weakness with subtle gestures. The trio worked as one, instincts and training melding into a force that neither bandits nor terrain could outmatch. The clash was brief but decisive. The attackers, realizing they had underestimated the defenders, faltered and fled back toward the shadows, their intentions exposed and their courage shattered. Braxton felt a rush of relief, tempered with awareness, and night had been a trial, a test not only of strength but of insight, strategy, and respect for the land. The plains were quiet once more, but the tension of the night lingered, a reminder of how easily chaos could have taken hold. Tequil lowered his knife, eyes scanning the horizon as if listening to the whispers of the plains. "The land tests every man who walks it," he said quietly. "It shows the truth of courage, the depth of patience, and the value of trust." Braxton nodded, understanding at last what the Apache had been teaching him all night. This was not just a battle over territory or pride, it was a lesson in respect, in awareness, and in the delicate balance between power and wisdom. Leora stepped forward, brushing the dirt from her coat. "You both handled it well," she said, voice steady but carrying a note of relief. "The attackers won't return for a while, and the story of this night will spread. They'll know the ruins are guarded, and that Tequil is not a man to challenge lightly." Braxton felt a weight lift from his shoulders, yet he also realized that the night's lessons would stay with him far longer than the adrenaline of confrontation. They returned to the ruins of the house, its charred timbers glowing faintly under the rising moon. Braxton's eyes traced the beams, the collapsed walls, and the scattered ash. In those ruins lay more than memories, they held lessons, history, and a connection to a land that demanded respect and care. Tequil knelt, brushing ash from a partially buried wooden box, lifted it carefully, revealing its contents. Maps, old letters, and artifacts that spoke of generations who had walked the plains long before either of them had been born. Braxton stepped closer, awe in his voice. This is incredible. These people. They lived and fought here, and they left all of this behind." Tequil nodded, eyes fixed on the artifacts. "Every place carries its story," he said, "and every story shapes what comes next. You've learned to listen tonight, and that matters more than any gun or strategy." Leora examined the maps, her sharp eyes noticing details even Braxton and Tequil had overlooked. These show water sources, hidden paths, and safe passages through the plains. Whoever left them intended for someone to find them, to learn from them, not just survive but thrive. Her words carried the weight of discovery. This was more than survival. It was a treasure of knowledge, a guide for anyone willing to respect the land and its lessons. Braxton felt a sense of connection deepened, not just to the land, but to Tequil and Leora. He had entered the ruins intent on destruction, yet he left with insight, understanding, and a bond forged in the crucible of night. Tequil, for his part, had revealed the depth of his knowledge without arrogance, teaching the value of observation, patience, and respect. Leora had contributed strategy and perspective, completing a trio that had faced danger and emerged wiser and stronger. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight spilled across the plains, illuminating the ruins in soft gold. The fire that had begun as destruction now seemed to highlight renewal. Braxton looked at the remnants of the house, the artifacts, and the people around him and understood something he had never realized before. The past could not be erased, but it could guide the future. The plains, once a silent witness, now held the promise of growth, protection, and opportunity. Tequil handed Braxton one of the letters, its edges worn but its contents clear. "This speaks of responsibility," he said, "of guarding what is important, not just for yourself but for those who will follow. The land will test you again, but the lessons you've learned tonight will carry you through." Braxton accepted it with reverence, realizing that he had not only survived the night, but had also gained a new sense of purpose. Leora smiled, a rare warmth in her eyes. "You're ready," she said. "The land, the ruins, the people, they've all left their mark on you. You'll make better choices, protect what matters, and see threats before they arrive." That's what tonight has shown. Braxton nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. He had entered with pride and anger, intent on destruction. He left with clarity, humility, and a vision for the future. The plains stretched endlessly before them, golden and quiet under the early morning sun. Tequil stood at the edge of the clearing, his presence calm but commanding. Braxton felt a surge of respect, understanding that the Apache's role was not merely as a protector of the ruins, but as a guide, a teacher, and a keeper of the lands. Memory. He had learned that strength alone was never enough. Wisdom, patience, and respect were just as essential. Leora gathered the maps and letters carefully, securing them for study and preservation. "These belong to the land and to those who care enough to learn," she said. "They are more valuable than any gold or cattle. They are lessons." Braxton looked at her, understanding that she had grown as much from the night's trials as he had. Together, they represented a new generation capable of respecting the plains while protecting its treasures. Tequil's eyes lingered on Braxton, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No words were necessary. The rancher had been tested, and he had learned. Pride had not been destroyed. It had been refined. Understanding had been earned. Respect had been established. In that quiet moment, Braxton realized that the night's trials had revealed not only the land's power, but the potential within himself. The bandits who had threatened them would not return, and the ruins of the house would remain a symbol of endurance, knowledge, and vigilance. The land itself seemed to settle, as if recognizing that balance had been restored. Braxton, Tequil, and Leora stood together, a united front against future uncertainty, their bond strengthened by the challenges of the night. As the sun climbed higher, warming the plains and drying the ash, Braxton spoke finally. "This land, it's more than I ever knew. The past, the lessons, the people who walked here before us, they all matter. And now, I think I understand what it means to protect what's important." Tequil nodded slowly, satisfied that the rancher had grasped the depth of the lesson. Leora smiled, her gaze sweeping over the plains, the ruins, and the horizon beyond. There was a sense of peace in the morning, a quiet resolution that came not from victory over others, but from mastery of self, understanding of the land, and respect for those who had come before. Braxton knew he would rebuild, not just structures, but trust, purpose, and a deeper connection to the plains. Tequil's presence would remain, a guardian of wisdom and history. Leora would continue her path, a scout and strategist, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and applied. Together, they looked out over the endless horizon, the plains glowing under the sun's early light. The ruins behind them were no longer symbols of destruction, but of transformation. The trials, the fear, and the suspense of the night had yielded clarity, strength, and hope. The Apache legend, the rancher's courage, and the scout's insight had converged to create not just survival, but a path toward renewal and harmony. Braxton took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night lift from him. "The land teaches," he said quietly, almost to himself. "If we listen, it gives strength, guidance, and purpose. We've learned that tonight." Tequil nodded, a silent affirmation, while Leora adjusted the maps she carried, ready for the next chapter in the plains' unfolding story. And as the sun rose higher, casting light across the hills and valleys, the three of them understood that the old house, once a ruin, had become a symbol, a place where fear, legend, and courage had collided and left behind lessons that would endure. The plains whispered of trials past and promises yet to be fulfilled. But for the first time, Braxton Tocqueville and Leora felt that they could meet whatever came next with wisdom, courage, and unity. The wind carried a soft, steady hum across the plains, a song of survival and understanding. The ruins had witnessed history, and now they bore witness to a future shaped by respect, insight, and courage.
Braxton.
To its guardians, and to a story that would guide him for years to come. And in the quiet of that morning, as shadows receded and the plains stretched endlessly before them, all three understood the most important lesson of all. Strength alone cannot protect what is precious. Only wisdom, courage, and trust can ensure the legacy of the land, the stories of the past, and the promise of tomorrow.